The dust billowed across the Kansas horizon as Julia Reynolds clutched the doctor's letter in trembling fingers. Her worst fears confirmed in cold, clinical language that seemed to echo through her empty womb. Concordia, Kansas was a small enough town that news traveled faster than tumbleweeds in a windstorm, and by sundown tomorrow, everyone would know her shame. It was 1878, and the doctor's verdict was final. Julia would never bear children. At 24, she'd already endured 5 years of whispers behind her back, of pitying glances from the women who gathered at church socials with their broods of children. Her marriage to Thomas had ended in both heartbreak and humiliation when he'd left her for a widow who'd already proven her fertility with 3 healthy sons. Julia stood on the boardwalk outside the doctor's office, the summer sun beating down on her navy bonnet as she tried to compose herself. Concordia was growing, like many frontier towns, but it wasn't large enough to hide in. Already she could feel eyes on her as she carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her reticule. "You've got the look of someone who's lost their last friend," came a deep voice. Julia looked up to see Quentin Vaughn, the rancher who'd bought Old Man Peterson's place 2 years ago. At 32, he was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the county, though he seemed content to focus on building his cattle operation rather than finding a wife. His tall frame cast a shadow that provided momentary relief from the punishing sun. "Just some unwelcome news, Mr. Vaughn," Julia replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing worth troubling yourself over." Quentin studied her face with eyes the color of a winter sky. "Sometimes troubles shared are troubles halved, Miss Reynolds." His voice was gentle, but Julia felt a flash of irritation. "Mrs. Reynolds," she corrected automatically. "Though I suppose soon enough it'll be Miss Bailey again." She hadn't meant to say that aloud, and heat rushed to her cheeks. Quentin's expression softened. "My apologies, Mrs. Reynolds." He tipped his hat. "If you're heading back toward Bailey's Mercantile, might I escort you? My wagon's just down the street." Julia hesitated. Her father's store was at the other end of town, and the walk suddenly seemed impossibly long. She nodded, grateful for the offer despite her embarrassment. As they walked to his wagon, Julia was keenly aware of the stares. Concordia had always been full of gossips, but since Thomas had left, the whispers had only intensified. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight as an arrow. "Don't pay them any mind," Quentin said quietly. "Most folks are just looking for stories to tell because their own lives are too dull." A small laugh escaped her. "You sound like my father." Quentin helped her onto the wagon bench, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "Your father's a wise man. I've always enjoyed our conversations when I come in for supplies." As the wagon rumbled down the dusty street, Julia found herself studying Quentin's profile. His jaw was strong, his skin tanned from hours under the sun. A scar ran along his left temple, disappearing into his sandy brown hair. Unlike many men in Concordia, he kept himself clean-shaven, though she'd heard that in winter he sometimes grew a beard. "I appreciate the ride, Mr. Vaughn," she said as they approached the Mercantile. "It was kind of you." Quentin turned to look at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Kindness is in short supply sometimes. We should offer it when we can." He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Bailey's Mercantile. Before he could come around to help her down, Julia was startled by a high-pitched voice. "Well, if it isn't the barren widow Reynolds. Already setting your cap for a new husband, are you?" Poor Mr. Vaughn should know what he's getting into, a woman who can't even do what the good Lord made her for. Margaret Spencer stood on the boardwalk, her thin face twisted in malicious glee. At 40, she had borne 7 children and never let anyone forget it, as if fertility were a virtue rather than biological fortune. Julia froze, mortification washing over her in a scalding wave. The doctor's letter seemed to burn through her reticule. Before she could respond, Quentin was beside the wagon, his face darkened with anger. "Mrs. Spencer," he said, his voice low but carrying, "I suggest you mind your own affairs before someone takes an interest in yours. I hear your husband spends an awful lot of time at the Painted Lady Saloon for a man of such high moral standing." Margaret's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, then closed it, before turning on her heel and hurrying away. Quentin turned back to Julia, offering his hand to help her down. "I apologize for speaking out of turn." Julia placed her hand in his, oddly comforted by the rough calluses against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, "though I fear you've only given her more to gossip about." "Let her gossip," he replied, his gaze steady on hers. "What was it you said about unwelcome news earlier? Something that made you think you'd be returning to your maiden name?" Julia hesitated. She hardly knew Quentin Vaughn beyond his visits to her father's store, yet something about his direct manner made her want to confide in him. "My husband left me because I couldn't give him children," she said quietly. "And today the doctor confirmed I never will. In a place like Concordia well, you heard Mrs. Spencer. It defines me now." Quentin's expression remained unchanged, but something flickered in his eyes. "A man who leaves over something like that isn't worth keeping." He seemed about to say more when the mercantile door opened. Jacob Bailey, Julia's father, emerged with a worried expression that cleared when he saw his daughter. "Julia, I was beginning to wonder if the doctor had kept you." "Mr. Vaughn, good to see you." "Mr. Bailey," Quentin nodded respectfully, "just giving your daughter a ride back. It's too hot to be walking in this dust." "Much appreciated." Jacob's eyes darted between them with a shopkeeper's shrewd assessment. "Will you be needing anything today?" "We just got in some new tools from St. Louis." "Not today, sir, but I'll be by next week for my usual order." Quentin turned to Julia. "Mrs. Reynolds, it was a pleasure." He tipped his hat again and climbed back onto his wagon. As he drove away, Julia felt her father's questioning gaze. "It was just a ride, Pa, nothing more." Jacob sighed. "Come inside, Julia, you look done in." Inside the cool dimness of the mercantile, Julia helped her father with the afternoon customers, grateful for the distraction. But her mind kept returning to Quentin Vaughn's steady gaze and his swift defense of her. That evening, as she and her father ate dinner in their quarters behind the store, Jacob finally asked the question she'd been dreading. "What did the doctor say, Julia?" She set down her fork, the stew suddenly tasteless. "He confirmed what we already suspected. I'll never have children." Her voice caught on the last word. Jacob reached across the table to take her hand. At 60, his fingers were gnarled with arthritis, but his grip was still strong. "I'm sorry, my girl, but you know that doesn't lessen your worth in the eyes of the Lord, or in mine." "But it does in the eyes of everyone else," Julia replied bitterly. "And it did in Thomas's eyes." "Thomas Reynolds was a fool who didn't deserve you," Jacob said firmly. "And anyone who judges you for this isn't worth your concern." Julia gave him a sad smile. "You and Mr. Vaughn seem to share the same opinion on that." "Quentin Vaughn said that." Jacob raised his eyebrows. "He's a good man, smart with his business, fair with his hands. Not like some of these ranchers who come in here putting on airs." "He defended me against Margaret Spencer today," Julia admitted. "She was particularly cruel." Jacob scowled. "That woman needs to mind her tongue. Her oldest boy was caught stealing from the bank last month, but you don't hear her crowing about that." Julia was surprised. "I hadn't heard." "Bank manager hushed it up out of respect for the family, which is more than she's shown you." Jacob squeezed her hand. "Don't you worry about Margaret Spencer or anyone else. You've got plenty to offer beyond bearing children." Julia wished she could believe him, but in a frontier town like Concordia, a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce the next generation of settlers. Without that, what was she but a burden? The next morning, Julia was arranging a display of canned goods when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to see Quentin Vaughn stepping inside, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," he said, nodding politely. "Is your father available?" "He's gone to the freight office to check on a shipment," Julia replied. "Is there something I can help you with?" Quentin approached the counter. "Actually, I came to speak with you." Julia felt a flutter of nervousness. "With me?" "Yes." He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "I was wondering if you might consider coming out to my ranch on Sunday for dinner." Julia stared at him, sure she'd misheard. "Dinner at your ranch? My housekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, is an excellent cook," he said quickly. "And I thought, well, it might be nice to get away from town for a spell." Julia's mind raced. A single woman dining alone with a bachelor would set tongues wagging even more than they already were. "Mr. Vaughn, I appreciate the invitation, but I don't think that would be proper." "Your father would be welcome too, of course," Quentin added. "I should have mentioned that from the start." The invitation suddenly made more sense. Quentin was likely hoping to discuss business with her father in a more comfortable setting than the mercantile. The inclusion of Julia was merely politeness. "I'll ask him when he returns," she promised. "Thank you for the invitation." Quentin nodded, his expression unreadable. "I hope you'll both come." He hesitated. "And Mrs. Reynolds, what I said yesterday about a man who would leave over. Well, I meant it. Some men measure worth by the wrong things." Before Julia could respond, he had turned and left the store, leaving her staring after him in confusion. When Jacob returned, Julia relayed the invitation. To her surprise, her father looked pleased. Dinner at the Vaughn ranch. "Well now, that's interesting." "I assumed he wanted to discuss business with you," Julia said, folding a stack of calico. Jacob chuckled. "Quentin Vaughn could discuss business with me any day of the week right here in this store. He didn't need to invite us to Sunday dinner for that." Julia paused in her folding. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Jacob said innocently. "Just making an observation, and I think we should accept. It'll do you good to get out of town for a bit." Julia wasn't so sure, but she had to admit that the idea of escaping Concordia's watchful eyes for even an afternoon was appealing. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Julia wore her best dress, a cornflower blue that matched her eyes, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She pinned her dark hair up carefully, weaving a blue ribbon through the braided crown. As they drove their buggy out of town, Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation mingled with anxiety. She'd never been to Quentin's ranch before. She knew it was prosperous. His regular orders at the mercantile spoke to that, but beyond that, she knew little about how he lived. The Vaughn ranch appeared on the horizon after about 40 minutes of travel. Julia was surprised by its size and the obvious care that had gone into its construction. The main house was a substantial two-story structure with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings, a barn and corrals completed the scene. Unlike many frontier homesteads that appeared hastily constructed, Quentin's place had the look of permanence. As they pulled up to the hitching post, the front door opened and Quentin emerged. He traded his usual work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, though he wore the same worn leather boots. "Mr. Bailey, Mrs. Reynolds," he greeted them, helping Julia down from the buggy. "I'm glad you could come. Wouldn't miss Mrs. Holloway's cooking," Jacob said with a grin. "Julia's been looking forward to it too, haven't you, daughter?" Julia shot her father a look. "It's kind of you to invite us, Mr. Vaughn." Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable. The furnishings weren't fancy, but they were solid and well made. A woman in her 50s with iron gray hair bustled out to meet them. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Mr. Bailey and his daughter, Mrs. Reynolds," Quentin introduced them. "Welcome to you both," Mrs. Holloway said warmly. "Dinner's nearly ready. Mr. Vaughn, why don't you show them the house while I finish up?" Quentin gave them a tour, explaining how he'd expanded the original homestead over the past 2 years. "The previous owner built it solid, but it was too small for my needs," he explained. "I added the second story last year." "You've done well for yourself," Jacob observed. "How many head of cattle are you running now?" "Just over 300, Quentin replied. "Not as many as some, but they're quality stock. I'm focusing on breeding rather than quantity." As they moved through the house, Julia was struck by how spacious it was for a single man. "It's a beautiful home," she said sincerely, "though it seems large for one person." Quentin's eyes met hers. "I've always believed in building for the future, not just the present." There was something in his gaze that made Julia look away first, a warmth that unsettled her. Dinner was as delicious as promised. Mrs. Holloway had prepared a roast with vegetables from Quentin's garden, fresh baked bread, and an apple pie that rivaled any Julia had ever tasted. The conversation flowed easily, with Jacob and Quentin discussing everything from cattle prices to the railroad's expansion plans. Julia found herself watching Quentin as he spoke, noting the animation in his face when he discussed his plans for the ranch. There was an intelligence and thoughtfulness to him that she hadn't fully appreciated before. After dinner, Mrs. Holloway insisted on clearing up alone. "You go show Mrs. Reynolds the garden," she told Quentin. "Mr. Bailey and I have some catching up to do." Julia raised an eyebrow at this. As far as she knew, her father and Mrs. Holloway had never met, but Jacob was already agreeing enthusiastically. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-tended garden. Quentin walked beside Julia, pointing out various plantings. "Mrs. Holloway has a gift with growing things," he said. "I provide the labor, but she's the brains behind what goes where." "It's lovely," Julia said, admiring the neat rows of vegetables and the flower border that softened the edges. "Do you enjoy gardening, Mr. Vaughn? Call me Quentin, please." He smiled. "And yes, I do. There's something satisfying about planting something and watching it grow. Knowing your care makes a difference." They walked in silence for a moment, the only sound the buzz of insects and distant lowing of cattle. "Mrs. Reynolds, Julia, if I may, I have a confession to make," Quentin said suddenly. "I didn't invite you and your father here solely for the pleasure of your company, though that's been considerable." Julia stopped walking. "Oh, I wanted to speak with you away from the gossips in town." He turned to face her fully. "I know we don't know each other well, but I've admired you for some time. The way you've handled yourself with dignity despite the cruel talk." Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Vaughn, Quentin, I'm not sure what you're saying." "I'm saying that I would like to court you, Julia Reynolds." His directness took her breath away. "Properly, with your father's blessing." Julia stared at him, stunned. "Court me? But you know I can't, that I won't ever be able to have children." Quentin's expression remained steady. "I know what you told me, and I know it doesn't matter to me." "How can it not matter? Every man wants sons to carry on his name, to inherit what he's built." Julia gestured to the ranch around them. "What I want," Quentin said carefully, "is a partner. Someone of intelligence and character who I can build a life with. Children would be a blessing, yes, but they're not the only blessing worth having." Julia shook her head, overwhelmed. "You hardly know me." "I know enough." Quentin took a step closer. "I know you're kind to everyone who comes into that store, even the ones who whisper behind your back. I know you keep the books better than any banker in town. I know you can quote Shakespeare and calculate board feet in the same conversation. And I know you deserve better than to be defined by something you have no control over. Tears pricked at Julia's eyes. The whole town will say you're settling for less than you deserve. The whole town can go hang, Quentin said firmly. I know what I want. The question is, would you consider it? Consider me. Julia looked up at him, this man who had defended her without hesitation, who saw value in her that others dismissed. I would need time, to be sure. Quentin smiled, relief evident in his features. Time I can give. May I call on you properly? Take you to church socials, town gatherings. The idea of facing the town on Quentin's arm was both terrifying and strangely appealing. She would no longer be Julia Reynolds, the barren widow, but Julia Reynolds, being courted by one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. Yes, she found herself saying. You may call on me. The ride back to town was filled with conversation, though Julia noted that neither Quentin nor her father mentioned their discussion in the garden. It wasn't until they were back at the Mercantile, with Quentin saying his goodbyes, that Jacob pulled him aside for a private word. Julia watched them from the porch, her father's expression serious as he spoke, Quentin listening intently before nodding and shaking Jacob's hand firmly. After Quentin had ridden away, Julia turned to her father. What was that about? Jacob smiled enigmatically. Just setting some ground rules. He's going to come for dinner on Wednesday. True to his word, Quentin began calling on Julia regularly. Every Wednesday he would join them for dinner in their quarters behind the store. On Sundays, he would escort them to church, standing tall beside Julia as they faced the curious stares and whispers. Margaret Spencer was particularly venomous. I suppose when a man reaches a certain age, he'll take what he can get, Julia overheard her telling her circle of friends one Sunday. Even damaged goods. But Quentin seemed impervious to the gossip. He treated Julia with a respect and tenderness that gradually began to thaw the protective ice around her heart. One evening in late August, they sat on the Mercantile's back porch, watching fireflies rise from the tall grass behind the building. Jacob had discreetly made himself scarce, claiming a need to inventory the new shipment of nails. Tell me about your life before Concordia, Julia said, sipping lemonade Mrs. Holloway had sent with Quentin. Quentin was quiet for a moment. I grew up in Missouri on a small farm. My father died when I was 15, influenza, and I took over as best I could. My mother and I managed until she remarried 3 years later. You didn't stay with them. My stepfather was not a kind man. I left the day after the wedding and headed west. Quentin's voice was matter-of-fact, but Julia sensed old pain beneath the words. Worked as a ranch hand in Colorado for a while, then as a trail boss moving cattle. Saved every penny until I could buy my own place. And you chose Kansas. The land was right. Good water, good grass, and it felt like somewhere I could put down roots. He looked at her, his expression softening. I've never regretted it, but the house has always felt too empty. Julia understood what he wasn't saying. Do you have any other family? A sister in St. Louis. Married with 4 children now. He hesitated. Julia, there's something I should tell you. Something I haven't mentioned. Julia tensed, wondering what revelation was coming. Yes, I was married once before, he said quietly. When I was 23, her name was Sarah. Julia felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. What happened? She died in childbirth. Both she and the baby. His voice was steady, but Julia could see the old grief in his eyes. It was a hard winter and the doctor couldn't get through in time. Oh, Quentin. Julia reached for his hand instinctively. I'm so sorry. He turned his hand to clasp hers. It was a long time ago. But I wanted you to know. Some might say I'm courting you because I don't care about having children, but that's not true. I cared very much. I just learned that there are different ways to make a family." Julia felt tears threatening. "And you truly don't mind that I can't give you children? You wouldn't resent me for it later?" "How could I resent you for something that isn't your choice?" Quentin's grip on her hand tightened. "Julia, when Sarah died, I thought I'd never want to marry again. The risk seemed too great. But then I met you and I realized some risks are worth taking. Even with a woman the town calls barren." Julia couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Especially with a woman brave enough to hold her head high despite such cruelty." Quentin's gaze was steady. "I don't want just any wife, Julia. I want you." The conviction in his voice made her breath catch. For the first time since Thomas had left her, Julia felt truly seen not as a failing, but as a whole person with value beyond her ability to bear children. "May I kiss you, Julia Reynolds?" Quentin asked softly. Instead of answering, Julia leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, but when Quentin's hand came up to cup her cheek, it deepened into something that made her heart race. When they parted, Julia knew with sudden clarity that she was falling in love with Quentin Vaughn. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I should go," Quentin said, his voice husky, "before your father comes looking for us." Julia smiled. "He's probably watching from the window." Quentin chuckled. "All the more reason for me to be a gentleman and bid you good night." He stood, still holding her hand. "May I take you on a picnic this Saturday, just the two of us?" "What will people say?" Julia asked, though she was already nodding. "They'll say I'm the luckiest man in Kansas," Quentin replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss. And they'd be right. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Julia and Quentin's courtship continued. They went on picnics by the Republican River, attended the Harvest Festival together, and spent long evenings talking on the mercantile porch until the first frost made such activities impractical. The gossip in town had shifted. Some still whispered about Julia's inability to have children, but others had begun to speak with approval of Quentin's devotion. The fact that one of the county's most successful ranchers had chosen Julia despite her condition seemed to elevate her in the eyes of many. Margaret Spencer, however, remained venomous. "It's a shame he's wasting himself on her," Julia overheard her saying in the mercantile one day. "A man like that could have his pick of proper women who could give him sons." Julia had been about to step from behind the curtain that separated the store from their living quarters when she heard a new voice respond. "A proper woman wouldn't speak ill of others to make herself feel important," came Mrs. Holloway's crisp reply. "Mr. Vaughn knows what he wants, and it's not a sharp-tongued gossip who measures a person's worth by their womb." There was a gasp, and then the sound of the shop bell as Margaret apparently stormed out. Julia emerged to find Mrs. Holloway examining a bolt of fabric, looking completely unruffled. "Mrs. Holloway," Julia said hesitantly. "Thank you." The older woman looked up, her expression softening. "No need for thanks, Mrs. Reynolds. That woman needed setting straight years ago." She returned to examining the fabric. "This blue would suit you. Brings out your eyes." Julia smiled. "Are you here for supplies or did Quentin send you with a message?" "Both. We need flour and sugar, and Mr. Vaughn wanted me to tell you he'll be delayed tonight. One of the hands broke his arm and he's taking him to the doctor." Mrs. Holloway's shrewd eyes assessed Julia. "He hated to disappoint you." "It's not a disappointment. I'm glad he's taking care of his people." Julia began gathering Mrs. Holloway's order. "That's one of the things he admires about you," Mrs. Holloway said conversationally. "Your understanding nature. Not every woman would be so accepting of a man's responsibilities." Julia paused in measuring out sugar. "Has he said that?" Mrs. Holloway smiled. "Mr. Vaughn says quite a lot about you when we're alone at the ranch, all of it good." A warm feeling spread through Julia's chest. "I'm glad to hear it. He's a good man," Mrs. Holloway continued, her voice softening. "One of the best I've known. After Sarah died, I worried he'd never open his heart again, but with you—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Well, it's not my place to say more." Julia finished preparing the order, her mind whirling with questions she couldn't quite bring herself to ask. As she handed over the packages, she found her voice. "Mrs. Holloway, may I ask you something personal? You may ask. I may not answer." The older woman's eyes crinkled with humor. "Did you ever have children?" Mrs. Holloway's expression grew serious. "No, it wasn't in God's plan for me." She straightened her shoulders. "My husband and I tried for 10 years before he died in the war. After that, I made my way by keeping house for others. I've helped raise a dozen children who weren't mine by blood but became mine by love." Julia felt a connection with this straightforward woman that she hadn't expected. "And that was enough. You didn't feel incomplete." "Oh, there were hard days," Mrs. Holloway admitted. "Days when I questioned why the Lord saw fit to give children to women who neglected them while leaving my arms empty. But then, I'd remember that my purpose wasn't tied to my ability to bear children. It was tied to my ability to love. And love I did, in my own way." It was exactly what Julia needed to hear. "Thank you for sharing that with me." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Mr. Vaughn said to tell you he'll come by tomorrow to make up for missing dinner tonight." After she left, Julia stood in the quiet store, a new sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't alone in her situation, and perhaps there were indeed different ways to make a family, as Quentin had said. The next evening, Quentin arrived with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, handing it to Julia after greeting her father. "A token of apology for yesterday." Julia unwrapped it to find a book of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She opened the cover to see an inscription in Quentin's neat handwriting. "For Julia, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I'm counting new ones every day." "Q, Quentin," she breathed, looking up at him in wonder. "It's beautiful, thank you." "I remembered you mentioning she was your favorite poet," he said, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "I had it ordered from Chicago." Jacob cleared his throat. "I just remembered I need to check something in the storeroom. Excuse me." He disappeared with a knowing smile. As soon as they were alone, Quentin took Julia's hands in his. "I missed you yesterday," he said simply. "How is your ranch hand, the one with the broken arm?" "Mending well. Doc Simmons said it cleanly." Quentin's thumb traced circles on her palm. "Julia, I've been thinking about us." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, we've been courting for nearly 3 months now. I find myself thinking of you constantly. Wondering what you'd think of a new calf, or if you'd like the way the sunset looks from the north pasture." His eyes held hers steadily. "I love you, Julia Reynolds, and if you'll have me, I'd like to ask for your hand in marriage." Even though she'd begun to expect this moment, Julia found herself momentarily speechless. The sincerity in Quentin's eyes, the gentle pressure of his hands on hers, it was everything she'd stopped hoping for after Thomas left. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Truly sure? Because once it's done, there's no going back. You'll be tied to a woman who can never give you children." Quentin cupped her face in his hands. "Then we'll fill our house with love instead," he said firmly. "Love for each other, love for the life we build together. And if God sees fit to send children our way through other means, orphans who need a home, or children who need care, then we'll welcome them with open arms. But with or without them, I want you, Julia. Only you." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks as the weight of his words sank in. This was a man who saw her barrenness not as a failing but simply as a circumstance, one that could be navigated together. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Quentin's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and future. Jacob, who had clearly been listening from the storeroom, burst back in with suspicious timing. "Did I hear correctly? Are congratulations in order?" Julia laughed, wiping her tears as she turned to her father. "Yes, Pa, Quentin has asked me to marry him and I've accepted." Jacob beamed, pumping Quentin's hand vigorously. "I couldn't be happier. When will the wedding be?" "As soon as Julia wishes," Quentin said, his eyes never leaving her face. "Though I'd recommend before winter sets in fully if we want people from outlying farms to attend. Early December," Julia suggested. "That gives us just over a month to prepare." "Perfect," Quentin agreed. "We can be settled at the ranch before the worst of winter." As they began discussing details, Julia felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since the doctor had confirmed what she'd long suspected, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what she lacked, but by what she had found. The news of their engagement spread through Concordia like wildfire. Most people offered sincere congratulations, though some expressed surprise that Quentin would choose a woman known to be barren. Margaret Spencer was overheard saying it was the most foolish decision a man of his standing could make. But such remarks were increasingly met with disapproval. Mrs. Holloway took charge of preparing the ranch house for its new mistress, while Julia and her father made plans for who would take over the mercantile. Jacob was invited to live with them, of course, but he insisted on maintaining his independence. "I'll sell the business to young Henry Watson," he decided. "He's been wanting to branch out from the livery and he'll treat the customers right, but I'll keep our living quarters for now. You newlyweds don't need an old man underfoot." With the wedding approaching, Julia found herself increasingly at the ranch, helping to make it ready for their life together. She and Mrs. Holloway redecorated the main bedroom, replacing the plain furnishings with a handsome new bed and dresser ordered from Kansas City. One afternoon, while arranging new curtains, Julia noticed Quentin standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that made her heart flutter. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You look right there," he said simply. "Like you belong." Julia smiled, warmth spreading through her. "I was just thinking the same thing." Quentin crossed the room to take her hands. "There's something I want to show you, something I've been working on." He led her down the hallway to a door she hadn't paid much attention to before, assuming it was a spare bedroom. Quentin hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a room painted a cheerful yellow, with a rocking chair by the window and shelves along one wall. It was empty of furniture otherwise, but Julia immediately understood its purpose. "A nursery," she whispered, her throat tightening. "A room for a child," Quentin corrected gently. "Whether that's a baby we adopt, or an older child who needs a home, or even just a place for our friends' children to stay when they visit. I wanted you to know that I meant what I said. Our home will be filled with love in whatever form it comes." Julia turned to him, eyes swimming with tears. "Quentin Vaughn, how did I get so fortunate to find you?" "I ask myself the same question about you every day," he replied, pulling her into his arms. As they stood in the sunny room holding each other, Julia felt the last of her doubts melt away. This man, this house, this future, it was more than she had dared to hope for after Thomas's cruelty and the doctor's devastating news. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the first week of December bringing a dusting of snow that made Concordia look like something from a Christmas card. The small church was packed with well-wishers, including ranchers from miles around who respected Quentin, and customers of the mercantile who had known Julia all her life. Julia wore a gown of ivory satin with a high neck and long sleeves, her dark hair crowned with a wreath of winter greenery and white roses. As her father walked her down the aisle toward Quentin, who stood tall and handsome in a new black suit, she felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister asked, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Jacob's voice rang out clear and strong. "Her mother and I do." It was a loving fiction. Julia's mother had died when she was a child, but it felt right that both her parents were acknowledged on this day. When it came time for their vows, Quentin's voice never wavered. "I, Quentin James Vaughn, take you, Julia Marie Reynolds, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Julia's voice trembled slightly, but her conviction was firm. "I, Julia Marie Reynolds, take you, Quentin James Vaughn, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." The exchange of rings, a plain gold band for Quentin, and for Julia a delicate ring with a small diamond that had belonged to Quentin's mother, sealed their promises. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Quentin lifted Julia's veil and gazed at her with such love that she felt it like a physical warmth. His kiss was gentle but firm, a promise of the life they would build together. The reception was held at the town hall, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the season. As Julia moved among the guests on Quentin's arm, accepting congratulations and well wishes, she noticed Margaret Spencer standing alone by the punch bowl, her thin face sour. On impulse, Julia approached her. "Mrs. Spencer," she said politely, "thank you for coming." Margaret looked startled, then suspicious. "Mrs. Vaughn," she replied stiffly, "congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you." Julia hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I wanted to tell you that I harbor no ill feelings for the things you've said about me. I understand that they came from a place of concern for traditional values." Margaret's eyes widened at this unexpected graciousness. Well, I suppose I may have been hasty in my judgments." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as Margaret Spencer was likely to come to one. Julia nodded and moved on, feeling lighter for having extended the olive branch, regardless of whether it was accepted. Quentin, who had watched the exchange from a distance, pulled her into a quiet corner. "That was generous of you," he murmured. "More than she deserved." "Life's too short for grudges," Julia replied. "Especially today of all days." Quentin's eyes darkened with emotion. "Have I told you today how much I love you, Mrs. Vaughn?" "You have," Julia smiled, "but I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you," he whispered against her ear. "And I can't wait to take you home." Later that night, after the dancing and feasting were done, Quentin drove their wagon through the snow to the ranch. Julia sat close beside him, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak that had been his wedding gift to her. The stars were brilliant in the clear December sky, and the only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath the wheels and the horses' steady breathing. "Are you cold?" Quentin asked, putting his arm around her. "Not with you beside me," Julia replied, leaning against his strength. When they reached the ranch, light spilled from the windows. Mrs. Holloway had gone ahead to make sure the house was warm and welcoming for their return. But as Quentin helped Julia down from the wagon, she was surprised to see him scoop her into his arms. "What are you doing?" She laughed as he carried her toward the house. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he replied seriously. "It's tradition." Inside, the house was warm and fragrant with the scent of pine boughs and cinnamon. A fire crackled in the sitting room hearth, and a bottle of champagne sat cooling in a bucket of snow. Mrs. Holloway appeared from the kitchen, beaming at them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn." she said warmly. "Everything's ready for you both. I'll be leaving now. My sister's wagon is waiting. I'll be back the day after tomorrow." After she'd gone, leaving them truly alone, Quentin poured 2 glasses of champagne. "To us," he said, handing one to Julia, "and to our future." "To us," Julia echoed, taking a sip of the bubbly drink. She looked around the room, their room now, their home. "It feels different being here as your wife. Good different, I hope." Quentin set down his glass and moved closer to her. "Very good," Julia assured him, setting her own glass aside as his arms encircled her. Their first night as husband and wife was everything Julia had hoped for, tender, passionate, and full of the love they'd pledged to each other. Quentin was gentle, mindful that Julia's first marriage had left her with more scars than just the emotional ones. His patience and consideration brought her to heights of pleasure she hadn't known were possible. Afterward, lying in his arms, Julia traced the scar on his temple that she'd noticed the first day he'd given her a ride. "How did you get this?" she asked. Quentin caught her hand and kissed her fingertips. "Breaking in a wild Mustang when I was 20, he threw me into a fence post. And you still work with horses after that." "Got back on the next day," Quentin said with a smile. "Some things are worth the risk." Julia understood he wasn't just talking about horses. She nestled closer to him, marveling at how right it felt to be here, in this bed, in this house, with this man. The winter passed in a haze of newfound domestic happiness. Julia took to ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She learned to make butter from the milk of their small dairy herd, to manage the household accounts, and to direct the seasonal work of the ranch hands with the same efficiency she'd applied to the mercantile. Quentin, for his part, seemed to thrive with Julia by his side. The ranch had always been successful, but with her help, it became more organized and profitable. Her experience with the mercantile's books proved invaluable in tracking expenses and planning for expansion. They settled into routines that suited them both: early mornings with coffee by the fire before Quentin went out to work, midday meals together when possible, and long evenings sharing the day's events. They read aloud to each other from books ordered from Chicago and St. Louis, played chess, and simply enjoyed being together. The yellow room remained empty but not forgotten. They spoke sometimes of the children they might one day welcome, perhaps orphans from the recent smallpox outbreak in Topeka, or the children of settlers who had died on the trail west. But they were content for now with building their life together, establishing the foundation that would support whatever family they might eventually have. Spring brought new calves, fresh green grass, and plans for expanding the ranch's operations. Quentin purchased an adjacent property, doubling their grazing land and adding a small apple orchard that Julia was particularly excited about. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset, Quentin broached a subject that had been on his mind. "I had a letter from the orphanage in Topeka today," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They have more children than they can properly care for after the epidemic. They're asking if any families might be willing to take in a child or two." Julia's heart quickened. "Are you thinking we should consider it?" Quentin turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Only if you're ready. There's no rush, Julia. We have time." Julia thought about the yellow room waiting for its occupant, about the love that had grown between her and Quentin over the past months, love that seemed too abundant to keep just between the two of them. "I think I am ready," she said softly. "Not because I feel we're incomplete without children, but because we have so much to give. If there's a child who needs us, who we can help." Quentin's smile was radiant. "That's what I hoped you'd say. The orphanage mentioned they have a brother and sister, ages 3 and 5. Their parents both died in the epidemic. 2 children." Julia's eyes widened. Are you sure we're ready for that? Mrs. Holloway is already planning what to feed them, Quentin admitted with a laugh. And I thought, well, keeping siblings together seemed important. Julia leaned against him, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. When can we go to Topeka? Next week, if the weather holds for the train. Quentin pressed a kiss to her temple. The children's names are William and Emma Carter. William and Emma, Julia repeated, trying the names on her tongue. They sound perfect. The journey to Topeka was filled with both excitement and nervousness. Julia had sewn new clothes for the children based on the measurements the orphanage had provided, and Quentin had built a small trundle bed to go with the crib, already waiting in the yellow room. The orphanage was a grim, institutional building, overcrowded and understaffed despite the best efforts of the women who ran it. The matron, Mrs. Peterson, greeted them with evident relief. Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn, thank you for coming. We're at our wits' end trying to care for so many little ones. She led them through corridors filled with children of all ages, some playing quietly, others sitting listless or crying. The Carter children are this way. They've been very brave, but Emma has nightmares and William has stopped talking entirely since their parents died. Julia's heart constricted at the thought of such young children bearing such heavy grief. She squeezed Quentin's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. In a small room with half a dozen beds, they found Emma and William sitting side by side on a blanket, a worn wooden horse their only toy. Emma, the older at 5, had honey blonde hair and solemn blue eyes. William's hair was darker, and his thumb was firmly planted in his mouth. Emma, William, Mrs. Peterson said gently, these are Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn. They've come a long way to meet you. Emma looked up, her expression wary but hopeful. Are you taking us to a new home? Julia knelt down to the child's level. We'd like to, if you and William would want to come with us. We have a ranch with horses and cows and a room that's just waiting for children to make it their own. Will we stay together? Emma asked, her small arm tightening protectively around her brother. Of course, Quentin said, crouching beside Julia. Brothers and sisters should stay together. Emma studied them both carefully, with a seriousness that no 5-year-old should have to possess. Then she looked at her silent brother, who was watching Quentin with wide eyes. William likes horses, she informed them. Our papa used to put him on his shoulders and say he was riding a big stallion. Quentin smiled. We have a very gentle pony that William might learn to ride someday when he's ready. And plenty of kittens in the barn who would love to have children to play with them. At the mention of kittens, William's eyes lit up. He didn't speak, but he removed his thumb from his mouth, a promising sign. Would you like to come home with us, Emma and William? Julia asked softly. We can't replace your mama and papa, and we would never try to, but we have a lot of love to share, and we'd be honored if you'd be part of our family. Emma glanced at Mrs. Peterson, then back at Julia and Quentin. Can we take Horsey? She held up the wooden toy. Of course you can, Quentin said. Horsey is part of your family too. That simple acknowledgement of the toy's importance seemed to decide the matter for Emma. Okay, she said with the gravity of a child making an adult decision. We'll come with you. The paperwork took several hours: adoption papers, medical records, a letter from the minister in Concordia attesting to the Vaughn's character. By mid-afternoon, Emma and William Carter had officially become Emma and William Carter Vaughn. As they boarded the train for the journey back to Concordia, William still hadn't spoken, but he had allowed Quentin to carry him, his small head resting trustingly against Quentin's broad shoulder. Emma held Julia's hand tightly, asking questions about the ranch, the town, and whether there would be other children nearby for her to play with. Julia answered each question patiently, her heart expanding with love for this serious little girl who had taken on so much responsibility at such a young age. She caught Quentin's eye over the children's heads, seeing in his expression the same mix of joy, trepidation, and resolve that she felt. They were a family now, unexpected, unconventional, but a family nonetheless. And as the train carried them west toward Concordia and the ranch that would be the children's new home, Julia felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The first weeks with the children were challenging but rewarding. Emma had nightmares almost every night, waking screaming for her parents. Julia would hold her, rocking her back to sleep while singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her so many years ago. William remained silent, though he followed Quentin everywhere, watching with solemn eyes as the rancher went about his daily tasks. Quentin, with infinite patience, narrated everything he did, talking to the boy as if they were having a two-way conversation. "See how I'm brushing Daisy," he would say as he groomed the gentle mare he'd chosen for the children to eventually ride. "She likes long strokes like this. Would you like to try?" Slowly, William began to emerge from his shell. He still didn't speak, but he would nod or shake his head in response to questions. And one morning, Julia came into the kitchen to find him sitting on Mrs. Holloway's lap, solemnly helping to stir batter for pancakes. "Well now," Mrs. Holloway said with a wink at Julia, "I believe these will be the best pancakes Concordia has ever seen, thanks to William's excellent stirring." William didn't smile, but his chest puffed out with pride, and he continued his work with renewed vigor. Emma, meanwhile, had taken to following Julia as she went about her household duties. She was particularly fascinated by Julia's bookkeeping. "Why do you write all those numbers?" she asked one afternoon as Julia worked on the ranch accounts. "So we know how much money comes in and goes out," Julia explained. "It's like telling a story with numbers instead of words." Emma's brow furrowed in concentration. "Could I learn to do that?" "Of course you can," Julia said, pulling the girl onto her lap. "In fact, you can help me right now. Can you count these tally marks and tell me how many there are?" By summer, the children had begun to settle into life at the ranch. William still didn't speak, but he had formed a special bond with one of the barn kittens, a small orange tabby that he carried everywhere. Emma had started lessons with Julia, showing an aptitude for both reading and mathematics that made her adoptive mother proud. The town had welcomed the children with open arms. Even Margaret Spencer had mellowed, bringing over a quilt she'd made for William's bed and commenting that Emma had a good head on her shoulders, just like her new mama. Quentin and Julia took the children to church each Sunday, enduring with grace the curious stares and sometimes thoughtless questions. "Do they look like their real parents?" someone once asked within Emma's hearing. Before Julia could intervene, Emma herself had piped up. "Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn are our real parents now. Our first parents are in heaven." Julia had exchanged a look with Quentin, both of them moved by the simple wisdom in the child's words. As summer turned to autumn, and the first anniversary of their marriage approached, Julia found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the devastation of the doctor's confirmation of her infertility, to becoming mother to two children, who needed exactly what she and Quentin had to offer, a home filled with the love they'd promised each other on that December day. One evening, as they sat on the porch after the children were asleep, Quentin pulled Julia close against the growing chill in the air. "Happy?" he asked simply. "More than I ever thought possible," Julia replied, leaning into his warmth. "When I think of how close I came to refusing your courtship because I couldn't give you children." "You've given me everything I ever wanted," Quentin said, his voice husky with emotion. "A partner, a home that feels alive, a family." Julia turned in his arms to face him. I never thanked you properly, you know. For what? For seeing me, really seeing me when everyone else only saw what I couldn't do. She traced the lines of his face, still dear and becoming dearer with each passing day. For saying we'd fill our house with love instead. And haven't we? Quentin smiled, gesturing to the home behind them where two children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were wanted and cherished. We have, Julia agreed. Though I think there might be room for a little more. Quentin's eyebrows rose. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Mrs. Peterson wrote to me last week, Julia explained. There's a baby at the orphanage, a little boy, just 6 months old. His mother died in childbirth and his father couldn't care for him alone. She wondered if we might consider. Yes, Quentin said immediately, his eyes lighting with the same joy that had filled Julia when she'd read the letter. Yes, absolutely, Julia laughed, delighted by his instant response. Don't you want to know more about him first? I know he needs a home and we have one to offer. Quentin pulled her closer. And I know that our family doesn't feel complete yet, does it to you? No, Julia admitted. When I read about this baby, I felt a connection, as if he was already ours, just waiting for us to come get him. Then we'll go to Topeka as soon as we can arrange it. Quentin kissed her, a kiss full of promise for their growing family. What's his name? Daniel, Julia said softly. Daniel James. James was my father's name, Quentin said, his voice catching. I know. That's part of why it felt right. Julia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Our family is being built differently than we might have expected, but it's no less real for that. No less real and no less precious, Quentin agreed. Perhaps even more so because we've had to fight for it. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, the lights of their home glowing behind them and the promise of a new addition to their family on the horizon, Julia thought again of that terrible day when the doctor had confirmed her infertility. How could she have known then that what had seemed like an ending was actually a beginning? Her life with Quentin was proof that there were many ways to create a family. That love, not blood, was what truly mattered. And that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with the words, "Then we'll fill this house with love instead." 2 weeks later, they returned to Topeka, this time with Emma and William in tow. The children were excited about the prospect of a baby brother, though William still expressed himself only through nods and gestures. At the orphanage, Mrs. Peterson led them to a small nursery where half a dozen infants lay in cribs. She went to one in the corner and lifted a bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. "Here's Daniel," she said, bringing him to Julia. "He's been very healthy, despite his difficult start." Julia took the baby in her arms, looking down at a round face with dark blue eyes and a tuft of brown hair. Daniel gazed back at her solemnly, then broke into a toothless smile that melted her heart instantly. "Oh," she breathed, looking up at Quentin with tears in her eyes. "Oh, he's perfect." Quentin's own eyes were suspiciously bright as he reached out to stroke the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. "Hello, Daniel James," he said softly. "We're your family." Emma stood on tiptoe to peer at the baby. "He's so little," she marveled. "Can I hold him?" "When we get home," Julia promised, "you'll have plenty of time to hold your brother." William had been hanging back, watching with wide eyes. But at Julia's words, he took a step closer and reached out hesitantly toward the baby. Daniel caught his finger in a surprisingly strong grip, and William's face transformed with a smile, the first real smile they'd seen from him. And then, in a voice rusty from disuse, he spoke his first words since his parents' death. "My brother." Quentin's arm tightened around Julia's shoulders as they both struggled with emotion. Emma gasped and threw her arms around William, nearly knocking him over. "You talked," she exclaimed. "Mama, Papa, William talked, I heard," Julia said, tears streaming freely now. And what beautiful first words they were. The paperwork for Daniel's adoption went more quickly this time, as they were already approved adoptive parents. By evening, they were on the train back to Concordia, their family now numbering 5. Daniel proved to be a sunny-tempered baby who thrived under the adoring attention of his new family. William, having broken his silence, began to speak more each day, though he remained a quiet, thoughtful child. Emma appointed herself Daniel's official helper, bringing diapers and toys and reporting every smile or coo to anyone who would listen. News of the Vaughn's growing family spread through Concordia, and the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Quilts, baby clothes, and offers of help poured in. Even Margaret Spencer brought over a rocking horse she declared her children had outgrown, though it looked suspiciously new. "You've done a fine thing," she told Julia as they watched William cautiously try out the rocking horse. "Taking in these children who needed a home, it's a Christian act." Coming from Margaret, this was high praise indeed. Julia smiled graciously. "They've blessed us far more than we've blessed them." The ranch continued to prosper, and as the second anniversary of their marriage approached, Quentin suggested they host a Christmas gathering for friends and neighbors. "A celebration of our family," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Daniel asleep in Julia's arms and the older children playing a game of checkers nearby. "And a chance to properly thank everyone who's supported us." Julia loved the idea, and preparations began in earnest. The house was decorated with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and candles. Mrs. Holloway outdid herself planning a feast, and Emma helped Julia bake dozens of cookies in shapes of stars and angels. The day of the gathering dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow making the ranch look like a picture from a storybook. Guests began arriving in the early afternoon, Jacob Bailey, of course, and Henry Watson, who had taken over the mercantile, the minister and his wife, neighboring ranchers and their families, and even Margaret Spencer and her brood. The house rang with laughter and conversation. The children played games in one room while the adults visited in another. Daniel, now almost 10 months old, was passed from admiring arms to admiring arms, reveling in the attention. As evening fell and candles were lit, Quentin called for everyone's attention. He stood by the hearth, his arm around Julia's waist. The children gathered close. "We wanted to thank you all for coming today," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the room, "and for the support you've shown our family over the past year. When Julia and I married, we knew we wanted to create a home filled with love. We couldn't have imagined then what form that love would take, but standing here today with these 3 remarkable children, I can say without a doubt that we've been blessed beyond measure." Julia looked around at their guests, at her father's proud smile, at the genuine warmth in the faces turned toward them. Even Margaret Spencer looked moved, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "2 years ago," Julia added, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest, "I thought my life was defined by what I couldn't do, by what I lacked. I was wrong. Life isn't about what's missing, it's about what we choose to create with what we have." She looked up at Quentin, seeing in his eyes the same love and certainty she felt in her own heart. "We chose to fill our house with love, and love came to us in the form of Emma, William, and Daniel. We can't imagine our family any other way." Quentin pressed a kiss to her temple, and Emma leaned against her side while William held Daniel carefully in his arms. They were a family not formed in the traditional way, perhaps, but no less real, no less precious for that. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children were tucked into bed, Julia and Quentin stood on the porch, watching the stars glitter in the clear winter sky. "Did you ever imagine when you defended me against Margaret Spencer that day that we'd end up here?" Julia asked, leaning against him. Quentin's arms tightened around her. "Not the details, perhaps, but I knew even then that there was something special about you, something I wanted in my life." Julia turned in his embrace to face him. "I'm glad you were stubborn enough to pursue me, even when I tried to push you away." "Best decision I ever made," Quentin said with a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Though bringing home 3 children in less than a year might be a close second." Julia laughed, the sound carrying in the still night air. "Our house is certainly full now." "Full of love," Quentin corrected, his expression growing serious. "Just as I promised." As they stood together under the vast Kansas sky, surrounded by the home they'd built and the family they'd created, Julia knew with absolute certainty that she wouldn't change a single step of the journey that had brought them here. Her inability to bear children, once a source of such shame and grief, had led them to Emma, William, and Daniel, 3 souls who needed exactly what she and Quentin had to give. What had seemed like an ending had become the beginning of a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined. And if the people of Concordia had once whispered about the barren widow Reynolds, they now spoke of the Vaughn family with respect and admiration, not because Julia had somehow overcome her infertility, but because she and Quentin had demonstrated that family was defined by love, not biology. As Quentin bent to kiss her under the winter stars, Julia silently thanked God for unanswered prayers and unexpected blessings, and for the man who had seen beyond her perceived failings to the love they could build together. Their house was indeed filled with love, and it was more than enough.